He grabbed the door handle like he needed it to stay upright. His fingers wrapped around the metal and didn't let go, and for a moment the whole room just watched him hold on. My name is Nora Scott. And the man gripping that door handle was my son, Daniel, 31 years old, 6 feet tall, and absolutely certain, until 30 seconds ago, that he had won. There were 6 people in that room. My attorney, Lydia Okonkwo, sat with both hands flat on the table the way she does when she wants to look perfectly relaxed. My daughter-in-law, Renata, had pressed herself into the corner of the sectional like she could disappear into the upholstery if she held still long enough. Daniel's younger sister, my daughter Camille, stood near the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and her eyes on the floor. And then there was Daniel, standing between the entryway and the living room of the house he had tried to take from me, staring at a single piece of paper like it was written in a language he'd never learned. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't move from where I was seated. I just waited, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how we got here. I was at the Marriott Marquis in Atlanta when my phone started going. Not ringing, blowing up, the way it does when something has gone wrong and everyone decides to handle it by texting instead of talking. It was a Monday morning, the second day of a 3-day medical conference where I'd been asked to present a paper on post-surgical recovery protocols. I had a 9 o'clock panel and a coffee in my hand when the first text came in from Camille. It just said, "Mom, call me, that's never good." I stepped out of the conference hall and called her back. She picked up on the first ring, which also never means anything good, and before I could even say hello, she said, "Daniel changed the locks. All of them, he called the security company this morning and told them you weren't authorized anymore." I want to tell you that my first reaction was panic. It would make for a better story that way, me standing in a hotel hallway in Atlanta with my coffee going cold, heart racing, trying to figure out what to do. But honestly, my first reaction was something much quieter than panic. It was closer to recognition. The feeling you get when something you've been half expecting for years finally decides to arrive. I went back into the conference room. I sat through the rest of the panel. I presented my paper at 11, answered 3 questions from the audience, and then I went back to my room, sat down at the desk by the window, and pulled up everything I needed on my laptop. The deed. The property tax records going back to 2001. 23 years of mortgage statements with my name in the upper left corner of every single one. All of it documented, all of it mine. Then I made one call to Lydia Okonkwo, and I said 4 words. He finally did it. To understand this moment, you need to understand where it came from. And to understand where it came from, you need to know a few things about my family, about this house, and about a dynamic that had been building for the better part of a decade. I am 53 years old. I bought the house on Meridian Crest Drive in April of 2001, 14 months after my divorce from Daniel and Camille's father, a man named Roy Halstead who was charming and inconsistent in roughly equal measure. The divorce was civil, which surprised everyone who knew us, and Roy moved to Phoenix and eventually remarried. He's still there. He and Daniel have a fine relationship. He and I have the kind of relationship where we exchange birthday texts and nothing else, which suits us both. The house cost $412,000 in 2001. I put down $80,000 in cash, money I had saved over 7 years of working as a hospitalist physician at Emory University Hospital, and I took out a 30-year mortgage for the rest. By the time Daniel was in high school, it was worth somewhere around 800,000. By 2023, Zillow was estimating it at 1.5 million, which felt unreal every time I saw it. I had not moved. I had not renovated beyond what was necessary. The neighborhood had simply become something that people wanted, and my mortgage payments had stayed exactly the same, and time had done the rest. I tell you this not to impress you. I tell you this because Daniel knew these numbers. He had grown up watching the neighborhood change. He had watched the older houses on our street sell and get torn down and replaced with glass and steel things that sold for 2 million before the drywall was even dry. He understood what the house was worth. And somewhere in the last 3 or 4 years, he had started to think of it as something other than mine. I don't think it happened all at once. I think it was more like water, slow, patient, finding every small opening until the pressure became too much to hold. And the first small opening, if I'm being honest, was the fact that I let him move back in. He was 27 when he and Renata separated the first time. That separation lasted 8 months, they reconciled, and then 2 years later they separated again, and this time Daniel came to me and asked if he could stay at the house while things were being sorted out. I said yes. He moved into his old bedroom in the spring of 2021. Then Renata came back around. Then she moved in too. And then somehow a temporary arrangement stretched into 18 months, and then 2 years, And then I blinked, and it was the fall of 2023, and my son and daughter in law were living in my house as though they had always lived there, and I was navigating my own home around their schedules. That's the context. Now let me tell you about the incidents that made the bigger picture clear to me. The first one happened at Thanksgiving in 2021. I had just come off a 32-hour stretch at the hospital. We were short staffed again, which was a permanent condition by that point, and I came home to find that Renata had rearranged the kitchen. Not rearranged, exactly, reorganized. She had gone through every cabinet and moved things around according to what she called better flow, and she had put a small basket on the counter with a handwritten label that said NORA's things, as though she were a gracious host making space for a guest. My own kitchen. My own cabinets, 20 years of knowing exactly where everything was gone. I stood in the doorway for a moment. Renata was at the stove, and she turned around and gave me a smile that was genuinely warm. She's not a cold person, that's the complicated part, and said, I thought it might be easier for everyone. The old setup was a little chaotic. I looked at the basket with my name on it, then I smiled back. It looks great, I said. I went to my room, I closed the door, and I called Lydia Okonkwo for the first time. Not to file anything, not yet. Just to talk through what a formal cohabitation agreement would look like, and whether I should have one drafted before things went any further. Lydia asked me how serious the situation was. I told her I wasn't sure yet. She told me to call her when I was. That was the first time. The understanding I took from it was not anger, exactly. It was something more useful than anger. I understood that Renata had reorganized that kitchen not out of malice, but out of genuine confidence, the confidence of someone who had already decided, somewhere below the level of conscious thought, that this house was going to be hers. That's a very specific kind of confidence. It tells you something important about how long someone has been planning. What I didn't know at the time was that the conversation between Daniel and Renata about the house was already further along than a reorganized kitchen. The second incident was in the spring of 2022, at a dinner that Daniel organized for, and this was how he framed it, just the family. He invited his father Roy from Phoenix, Roy's wife Deborah, and his sister Camille. He cooked, which he does well when he puts his mind to it, and we sat around the dining room table that I had owned for 15 years and ate pasta, and talked about nothing in particular for the first 40 minutes. Then Roy set down his fork and said to me directly, Daniel mentioned you've been thinking about downsizing. I looked at Daniel. Daniel was looking at his plate. Has he? I said. He said you were finding the house a lot to manage on your own, Roy continued. He was using his reasonable voice, the one he used in the early years of our marriage whenever he wanted to discuss something without appearing to discuss it. And it's a lot of square footage for one person. Deborah, who is generally kind and perceptive in equal measure, looked between the two of us and found something very interesting to examine on her napkin. I took a sip of water. I've got 3,200 square feet and two people living with me, I said. I'm not finding it much to manage. Roy glanced at Daniel. Daniel still hadn't looked up. We were just wondering, Roy said, walking it back the way he always did when a conversation went sideways, about your long-term plans. My long-term plans, I told him, involve staying exactly where I am. That was all anyone said about the house that evening. But I noticed something on my way out of the dining room. Daniel had left a folder on the sideboard. I didn't open it right there, but I noted it. Later, after everyone had gone home or gone to bed, I went back and looked. It was a printout from a real estate website listings for condominiums. Two-bedroom units, priced between $300,000 and $400,000. The search filter was set to retirement communities. I was 50 years old at the time. I took a photo of the listing page with my phone and sent it to Lydia the next morning with a single line, things are progressing. She responded, ready when you are. What I understood from the second incident was this: Daniel had recruited his father. That meant the conversation had moved outside the walls of my house, outside of what I might be able to see or manage. It meant he was building something, even if he didn't yet know exactly what he was building. And it meant I needed to start building something too, more deliberately, more quietly than I'd been doing. I let it go. For the moment. The third incident was the one that settled everything for me, and it happened on an ordinary Tuesday in October of 2022. I was working from home. I'd had a telehealth block from 1 in the afternoon until 4, and I had come downstairs between appointments to make tea when I heard Daniel on the phone in the back room. He hadn't heard me come down. The door was half open. The equity is sitting there doing nothing, he was saying. If she sold now and moved somewhere smaller, she'd walk away with over $1 million in cash. She could put that in an account and live off the interest for the rest of her life. It makes sense for her too, that's what I'm saying, it's not just us. A pause, then, Renata found a place she really loves, it's 15 minutes from here. We'd be close, we'd still see her all the time. Another pause, shorter this time. I know, but she's not going to do it voluntarily, so we need to think about how we frame it. I stood in the kitchen with my hand on the kettle and I kept very still. There's a particular kind of cold that isn't a temperature, that comes from hearing the thing you suspected confirmed out loud by someone who loves you, or who is supposed to love you. That's what I felt standing there. I went back upstairs. I put on my headphones for my next appointment. And that evening, after Daniel and Renata had gone to their room, I sat at my desk and drafted an email to Lydia with a very specific request. I asked her to begin preparing a property protection filing. I asked her to document the current ownership status of the house in a way that would be indisputably clear in any future proceeding. And I asked her to look into whether a formal notice of occupancy limits was something we could put in place quietly, without Daniel or Renata knowing until I was ready. She wrote back within the hour. She said, "I've been waiting for this email. Let's meet Thursday. If you have ever been counted out by someone who should have known better, you know exactly what that silence feels like. The silence of standing in your own kitchen, in your own house, listening to your son explain to someone on the phone how to move you out of it. The silence isn't weakness, it's calculation." I had been calculating for almost 2 years by then, and what I had calculated was that I needed to be very, very ready before I moved. So let me tell you what ready looked like. In January of 2023, I met with Lydia Okonkwo at her office in Decatur, not in person, because Daniel sometimes asked me about my schedule in ways that felt more like surveillance than conversation, but over a secure video call from my hospital office on a Thursday afternoon between appointments. Lydia is a real estate and family law attorney who has handled two other matters for me over the years. She has a way of presenting complicated legal information that makes it feel completely manageable, which is the most useful quality a lawyer can have. She is also not cheap, which is fine, because the thing you have to understand about the last 3 years is that I was not, in any sense that matters, financially fragile. My salary as a hospitalist physician at Emory had grown steadily over 23 years. I had refinanced the mortgage in 2015 when interest rates were low, reduced the remaining term, and was 18 months from paying it off entirely. I had a retirement account managed by a financial advisor named Howard Bay at a firm in Buckhead. Howard had been managing my portfolio since 2012 and had been consistently, quietly excellent at it. I had a college fund that I had opened for my granddaughter, Daniel's daughter Priya, in 2019, when she was born, a 529 account with Fidelity that I funded myself and whose beneficiary paperwork was in my name as custodian. By January of 2023, that account had grown to $67,000. I say all of this to make one point clear. When Daniel was making phone calls about the equity sitting there doing nothing, he was working with a partial picture. What he knew was the house. What he didn't know was everything else. And everything else was considerable. Lydia and I spent that Thursday afternoon going through three things. First, we documented the ownership record of the house in a comprehensive package. Every payment, every tax record, the original deed, the refinancing documents, organized in a way that could be produced quickly and clearly to any third party who needed to see it. Second, we drafted a formal notice of occupancy terms, naming Daniel and Renata as temporary residents with no ownership interest or tenancy rights, which Lydia advised keeping in reserve rather than serving immediately. Third, and this is the part that Daniel had no idea was happening, Lydia connected me with a colleague of hers, an attorney named James Forey, who specialized in unlawful detainer proceedings, just in case the situation escalated to the point where I needed to remove Daniel and Renata from the property formally. I did not tell Daniel about any of these meetings. I did not tell Camille either, partly because she might feel she had to say something to her brother, and partly because I didn't want to put her in the middle of something she hadn't caused. What I told Daniel, when he asked about my Thursday afternoons, was that I was doing a professional development seminar on telehealth billing practices. He nodded and looked at his phone. That was the extent of his interest. The first close call happened in February. Renata had started having mail delivered to the house, not just personal mail, which would have been normal enough for someone living there, but mail addressed to her with the house address listed as her permanent residence, including a piece of forwarded financial correspondence from what looked like a home equity loan inquiry. I saw it on the kitchen counter one morning when I was leaving for work. It was face up. I don't know if that was intentional or careless. I chose to treat it as careless. I picked it up, looked at it for a moment, and set it back down in the same position. evening when we were all in the kitchen at the same time, which happened maybe 3 times a week. The four of us occupying the same space with the careful choreography of people who are managing something, Renata said. Did you see that mail on the counter? The financial thing? I set the pan I was holding down on the burner. I think so, I said. Something from a bank? Yeah. She was slicing a pepper and not looking at me. We've been looking at some options, just planning ahead. Smart, I said. Always good to plan ahead. She glanced up then, just briefly, and there was something in her expression that was very close to relief, as though my calm response was the answer she'd been hoping for. She smiled. I smiled back. And I went to my room that evening and called Lydia to report that Daniel and Renata appeared to be researching home equity products against a property they did not own. Lydia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "They can't actually borrow against it without your signature." "I know," I said, "but they clearly think they can, or they think they will be able to." Another silence. Then, "Nora, we may need to move faster than we planned." That conversation shifted the timeline. Up until February, I had been operating on the assumption that I had months, perhaps until the end of the year, before anything acute happened. After the home equity mail, I revised that assumption. I told Lydia to have the occupancy notice ready to serve on 2 weeks' notice, and I asked James Forey to have the unlawful detainer paperwork drafted to a point where it could be filed quickly if needed. And then I almost relaxed too early. The second close call was in April, about 6 weeks before the Atlanta conference. Daniel came home one evening while I was reviewing some paperwork at the dining room table, nothing sensitive, just hospital scheduling documents, and he sat down across from me with the specific body language of someone who has rehearsed a conversation. He folded his hands. "Mom, I want to talk to you about something, and I want you to hear me out before you respond." I set down my pen. "All right, Renata and I have been talking." He paused. "About the future. About what makes sense for the house. And we were thinking, what if we made this more formal? Like, what if we bought in, became part owners?" I kept my expression entirely neutral. "Tell me more about what you mean." "We'd pay you," he said quickly. "Not the full market value, obviously, because we've been contributing to the household, paying utilities, groceries, upkeep, but a fair amount. Something that would give you a cash injection and give us a stake. Make it an actual arrangement instead of this." He gestured vaguely. "This ambiguous thing." I looked at him for a moment. He had his father's jaw and my mother's eyes, and right then he looked very young, not in a sympathetic way. In the way of someone who has convinced himself that what he's proposing is reasonable. "What percentage were you thinking?" I asked. He shifted in his chair. 50-50 seems fair, given everything." I picked up my pen. "I'll think about it." He blinked. He'd expected either a yes or a fight. He hadn't expected that. "Really?" I said, "I'll think about it." He left the table looking uncertain, which was the right outcome. I needed him uncertain. Uncertain people wait. Waiting people don't act. I called Lydia from my car the next morning. I told her what Daniel had proposed. She was quiet, and then she said something I've thought about many times since. The offer to buy in means he knows he doesn't have a claim. If he thought he already had one, he wouldn't be asking. That was the moment I realized how precisely the situation had been defined, and how clearly I understood its edges, and how little he understood about where those edges actually were. I had less time than I thought. What I didn't know, not yet, was that Daniel had already made a decision, and that the conversation at the dining room table had not been the beginning of a negotiation. It had been a courtesy, the kind of courtesy you extend to someone right before you act without their consent, so that later you can say you tried to do it the right way. The Atlanta conference was scheduled for the second week of May. I had been on the program for 4 months. I had my presentation ready, my hotel booked, my flights confirmed. I told Daniel and Renata I'd be gone Monday through Wednesday. I kissed my granddaughter Priya goodbye. She was 4 years old by then, staying with us for the week while her parents sorted out a childcare gap, which in retrospect I understand was not a coincidence, and I drove to the airport at 5:30 in the morning and did not think once about the house during the flight. I was thinking about my paper. I was thinking about the panel. I was thinking about a colleague I'd been looking forward to seeing, a pulmonologist from Johns Hopkins named Vera Castillo, who I'd known for 15 years and who always makes me laugh at conferences the way almost no one else does. I was not thinking about the fact that somewhere over Atlanta, at approximately the same time my plane was landing, my son was on the phone with a locksmith. The locksmith's van was still in the driveway when Camille drove past the house that Monday morning. She called me 4 times before I picked up. I was between sessions at the conference, standing in a corridor outside the main hall, and when I finally answered, she said, "Mom, his car is there. Renata's car is there, and there's a man changing the lock on the front door right now." I pressed the phone against my ear and thought about what I was hearing. "How many locks?" I asked. A pause. "I can see him on the front door. But Daniel, Mom, Daniel told me last night there are 6. He changed all six locks. That meant the front door, the back door, the garage entry, the side gate, the storm door on the sunroom, and the deadbolt on the basement. I had installed those locks over 22 years. I knew every one of them. Are you inside? No, I'm in the car. I drove by. I didn't stop. Good, don't stop. Go home, Camille. Mom, go home. I'll call you tonight. I hung up. I stood in that conference corridor for approximately 45 seconds, looking at the carpet pattern. Then I went back into the session and listened to a cardiologist from Northwestern present a paper on post-discharge care protocols for the next 40 minutes. I want to explain why I did that, because it probably sounds like shock or denial or some kind of fracturing. It wasn't any of those things. It was something I'd learned over 30 years of practicing medicine, which is that the worst possible thing you can do in a crisis is act before you've thought. 45 seconds is enough time to think if you use them correctly. By the time I sat back down in that conference room, I had already made three decisions. First, I would not call the police until I had spoken with Lydia. Second, I would not call Daniel until I knew exactly what I was going to say. Third, I would finish the conference, because my professional life was not going to be derailed by something my son had done to a building. What I felt, underneath those three decisions, was not anger. Not yet. It was something harder and colder and more useful than anger. It was the recognition that the conversation at the dining room table back in April, the one where he had proposed buying in at 50-50, had not been a negotiation at all. It had been a test. He was testing whether I would react, whether I would dig in, whether I would make my position explicit. And when I hadn't, when I had said, I'll think about it, and let him walk away uncertain, he had taken that ambiguity as permission. He was wrong about the ambiguity. He was wrong about the permission. And he was about to find out exactly how wrong on both counts. I called Lydia from my hotel room at 6:15 that evening. She picked up immediately, which told me she had already heard. I found out later that Camille had called her directly, having had Lydia's number from a conversation we'd had at Thanksgiving where I had, without being entirely explicit about why, mentioned her name. Tell me what you know, Lydia said. I told her everything Camille had reported, the locksmith, the six locks, the call Daniel had made to the security company removing my authorization. When I finished, Lydia was quiet for 4 full seconds. Okay? Her voice was exactly as level as mine. This is criminal trespass, potentially unlawful eviction, depending on how a court characterizes the occupancy arrangement. He has no legal authority to change any lock on that property. I know. I'm going to call James Forey tonight. We'll have the unlawful detainer filing ready to go by morning. But Nora, I want to ask you something first. Go ahead. Do you want to involve the police tonight, or do you want to wait and handle this through civil proceedings? I thought about Priya. My granddaughter was 4 years old and she had been at the house when I left on Sunday morning, and as far as I knew, she was still there, and whatever happened next was going to happen in a house where a 4-year-old was present. Civil, I said. Oh, but I want everything ready. Everything will be ready, Lydia said. Can you be back in Atlanta by Wednesday? I'm already in Atlanta. A short pause. I meant back home in Atlanta, Georgia. Lydia, I took a breath. I'm at a conference in Atlanta. I live in Atlanta. I have always lived in Atlanta. Another pause, and then she laughed, a real, sudden laugh that broke the tension in a way nothing else could have. Lord, of course you do. Okay, can you be back at the house by Wednesday? My flight lands Wednesday at 2:45 in the afternoon. Good. I want to be there when you arrive. I want a locksmith of our own, a copy of the deed in your hand, and James on the phone. We're going to walk you back into your own house with documentation that would hold up in any court in Georgia. And Daniel? Her voice settled back into its professional register. Daniel is going to learn something about property law that he apparently didn't know before. If you are still with me, stay, because what happened when I landed on Wednesday is the reason I am telling you this story. My flight landed at 2:41. I texted Lydia from the gate. She was already at the house when my Uber pulled up. Her car was parked at the curb, and beside it was a white van from a locksmith company called Crestview Security whose owner, a man named Alberto Garza, she had apparently used before in exactly this kind of situation. Alberto had a calm, professional manner and a bag of tools and zero interest in the drama of the situation, which I appreciated enormously. I walked up to my own front door and knocked. I knocked because Lydia had advised it. Not out of courtesy, out of documentation. If it ever went to court, we wanted a record that I had made reasonable attempts to access the property through normal means before we brought in Alberto. Nobody answered. I knocked again. 30 seconds. Nothing. I looked at Lydia. She nodded. I stepped aside and Alberto went to work. It took him 11 minutes to open the front door. I know because I timed it. Lydia stood beside me with a folder of documents under her arm and her phone recording the entire process on video. which was her idea and a very good one. When the door finally swung open, I walked into my own house for the first time in 72 hours. It was quiet. Daniel's car was in the garage, but the house felt empty. I went through the main floor methodically, kitchen, living room, sunroom, and then I heard footsteps upstairs. Daniel came down the staircase and stopped on the fourth step from the bottom when he saw me. He looked at Lydia. He looked at Alberto, who was doing something professional and unbothered with the front door locked behind me. He looked back at me. His mouth opened and nothing came out. He put his hand on the banister. He gripped it tight enough that I could see the tendons in his wrist. How did you? He stopped, started again. We changed the locks. I know. I set my bag down on the table by the door, the one that had been there since 2003. Alberto just changed them back. Daniel came down the last four steps. He was wearing a t-shirt and jeans, and the look on his face was the particular expression of someone whose plan has arrived at an outcome they genuinely did not anticipate. Not guilt, not yet, shock, pure unguarded shock. You can't just, he looked at Lydia again. Who is this? This is Lydia Okonkwo. She's my attorney. She's been my attorney for several years. Renata appeared at the top of the staircase then. She stood there with one hand on the wall and she looked down at the scene below her, and something shifted in her face, not the shock that was on Daniel's face, but something closer to the recognition I had felt in the hotel corridor in Atlanta. She had known, somewhere below the level of what she was willing to say out loud, that this was always a possibility. She came downstairs slowly. Lydia looked at them both. I've taken the liberty of calling a meeting for Friday evening, she said. 7 o'clock here in this house. I'd like everyone who has a stake in this property's future to be present. That includes both of you, Camille if she's willing to come, and Roy if he wants to fly in, though his presence is optional since he has no legal standing in this matter. Daniel's hand finally came off the banister. A meeting, he repeated. In our house. In my house, I said quietly, just those three words. He looked at me then, really looked at me, the way he hadn't since he was about 19 years old and I had told him something true that he didn't want to hear. There was something in his expression that I recognized, too. Not contrition, not yet, but the first hairline fracture and the certainty he had been operating on for the last 2 years. Friday, he said. 7 o'clock, Lydia confirmed. The next 48 hours were the quietest of the entire preceding 2 years. Daniel and Renata stayed in the house. Lydia had advised against forcing them out before the meeting, since we had the documentation to support anything we needed to do legally, and a cleaner resolution was preferable if it was available. I slept in my own bedroom. I had dinner at the kitchen table by myself both nights. On Thursday evening, I went through my folder of documents one final time with Lydia over a video call, and when we were done, she said, You have everything. You've always had everything. Tomorrow is just the moment where everyone else finds out. Roy flew in from Phoenix on Friday afternoon. He called me from the airport to say he was coming, which I appreciated. He arrived at the house at 6:45, and when I opened the door to let him in, he looked at me for a long moment and then said, quietly, I didn't know it had got to this. I know, I said, and I believed him. Roy's flaws were never cruelty. They were complacency and half attention and a lifelong preference for the path of least resistance. He had been part of the pressure on me, but he had not understood what he was part of. There's a difference. Camille arrived at 6:50 alone. She hugged me at the door, tight, and didn't say anything. She sat down on the far end of the sectional and folded her arms and looked at her brother, and Daniel looked at the floor. Lydia arrived at exactly 7 and set her document bag on the dining room table. Alberto was not needed tonight. Tonight it was just paper. We all sat down, Daniel and Renata on the sectional, Roy in the armchair by the window, which had been his armchair years ago, and which he still moved toward by instinct. Camille on the far end, Lydia at the dining table beside me. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Daniel looked at Lydia and said, with the careful precision of someone who has been rehearsing, We'd like to understand the legal basis for what happened Wednesday. We were under the impression that you could change the locks on a property you don't own? Lydia's voice was pleasant and completely without edge, which was somehow more devastating than if she had raised it. Let's establish something first. Does everyone in this room understand whose name is on the deed to this property? Nora's, Roy said immediately. He said it before Daniel could say anything, and I saw Daniel's jaw tighten. Correct. Lydia opened the folder and placed the deed on the table, facing outward so that everyone could see it. Nora Scott, sole owner of record since April of 2001, 23 consecutive years of property tax payments under her name, 23 years of mortgage payments, all documented. She placed a second stack of papers beside the deed, not theatrical. Just factual. The mortgage, incidentally, will be paid off in full in approximately 18 months. Renata's eyes went to the papers. She picked up her glass of water and held it without drinking. We weren't disputing ownership, Daniel said. His voice had shifted slightly, less rehearsed now, more careful. We've been contributing to this household for years. We pay utilities, groceries. You do, I said, and I've appreciated that. But contributing to household expenses in someone else's home doesn't create an ownership interest. Not in Georgia, not anywhere. We weren't trying to claim ownership. He looked at Renata, then back at me. We were trying to. Renata has been managing this house. The cleaning, the repairs. Renata put her glass down with a small, precise click. Daniel, he stopped. She was looking at the papers on the table. Something in her posture had changed, the forward lean of confidence replaced by something more contained. She understood, I think, faster than Daniel did, exactly what that folder represented. What is it that you're actually asking us to do? She said, directing the question at Lydia. Lydia placed a third document on the table. This is a formal notice of occupancy terms. It documents Daniel and Renata's status in this property as temporary residents, not tenants, not co-owners, and not authorized agents of the property owner. It also includes a requirement to vacate the premises within 60 days, with the option to extend that to 90 days if both parties agree in writing. The word vacate landed in the room and stayed there. Roy shifted in his armchair. He looked at Daniel, and the look on his face was not anger but something more complicated, the expression of a man recognizing the shape of a situation and understanding, for the first time, that it had traveled much further than he realized before anyone told him about it. Daniel stood up. 60 days. You want us out in 60 days. 90 if you need it, I said. His voice came out tighter. And the conversation we had in April, where I proposed buying in, you said you'd think about it. I did think about it. And, I looked at him steadily. I thought about it for about 3 minutes, then I called Lydia. A beat of absolute silence. Camille, on the far end of the sectional, unfolded her arms and then refolded them the other way. Daniel sat back down. He was working through something internally, I could see it, the way his gaze moved from the papers on the table to Renata to me and back to the papers. He was looking for the angle, the countermove, the thing he could say that would change the geometry of this. Renata spoke first, her voice lower than it had been. The home equity inquiry, the one that came in the mail. I saw it, I said. We didn't pursue it. She was looking at me directly now, and I'll give her credit for that. She wasn't looking at the table, she was meeting my eyes. We looked into it, we didn't apply. I know, I said. Lydia confirmed that nothing was filed. That's the only reason we're having a conversation right now instead of a different kind of conversation. That landed too. Daniel's head came up. What does that mean? He asked. Lydia answered, professionally and without drama. Applying for a home equity loan against a property you don't own, using a name that isn't on the deed, constitutes attempted mortgage fraud. It's a felony in Georgia. Since no application was actually filed, there are no criminal charges to pursue. But it's important that everyone in this room understands where that line is so that no one accidentally crosses it in the future. Roy stood up from the armchair. He had not said much, and he had been very still, and when he moved it drew everyone's attention. He walked to the window and looked out at the street that had been his street once, the house that had been his house once, and then he turned around and looked at his son. Daniel, his voice was quiet. Did you know what you were doing? The question was not accusatory. It was genuine. Roy has always been better than me at asking genuine questions. Daniel looked at his father. Something happened in his face, not the collapse I might have expected, but a slow, specific deflation, like watching a structure lose pressure. I thought he stopped. I thought she would sell. I thought if we made it, if it felt like we were already part of it, she would just let it go. The honesty of that was unexpected. It was the most honest thing Daniel had said in 2 years, possibly longer. Renata looked at her husband, and the look was not supportive exactly. It was the look of someone recognizing, belatedly, that the thing they had been part of had just been named out loud, and that naming it had changed everything. I see, Roy said. He sat back down. Lydia put one more document on the table. This is the occupancy notice. I'd like both of you to review it tonight. You don't need to sign it immediately, you have until Monday at noon. But I want to be direct. If we don't have signatures by Monday, we move to the formal unlawful detainer filing, which involves the courts and becomes a matter of public record. Daniel picked up the document. His hands were steady, which I noticed because my hands had been steady too the whole time, and I had been watching for the moment when they might not be. He reviewed it, he was quiet for a long time, then he put it back on the table. I want to say something to you, he said. He was talking to me now, not to Lydia. Not a legal thing to you? The room waited. I told myself, he said slowly, choosing each word, that it was practical, that it made financial sense, that you'd be better off with liquidity than with a house you were rattling around in a loan. He paused. I wasn't thinking about it as taking something from you. I was thinking about it as he stopped again, shook his head once. That's a reason, not an excuse. I know the difference. I sat with that for a moment. I had not expected an honest accounting. It didn't change what had happened, but it mattered to me that he offered one. I know you did, I said. I also know that you changed 6 locks on my house while I was 3 states away at a medical conference. And whatever the reasoning was, that is what it was. His throat moved. He looked down at the occupancy notice. 90 days. 90 days, I confirmed. Renata had been quiet since Lydia's explanation of the mortgage fraud statute. She was still quiet now. But she looked at me once, just briefly, and what I saw in her face was not resentment. It was something closer to exhaustion. She had been carrying this plan for a long time, and now that it had arrived at its actual ending, she looked like someone who had been running and could finally stop. "We'll sign," she said. Her voice was flat and resolved. "We'll sign Monday." Camille, on the far end of the sectional, let out a long, slow breath that she had apparently been holding for most of the meeting. Roy stayed another hour after Lydia left. We sat in the kitchen and drank coffee and talked about Priya, who was at a neighbor's house during the meeting and who was, in the uncomplicated and resilient way of 4-year-olds, entirely fine. Roy told me he was sorry. I told him I knew. We didn't resolve 25 years of marital history or the complicated inheritance of the parenting decisions we had made, but we didn't need to. We just sat in the kitchen and drank coffee, and that was enough. Daniel and Renata signed the occupancy notice on Monday, 23 minutes before noon. They were out of the house in 78 days. Lydia had the termination of occupancy documented and filed before their last box left the building. I changed the locks again myself, not all 6, just the front and back, and I kept the key. In the months that followed, Daniel and Renata rented a townhouse in Decatur, which was, by my estimate, approximately 600 square feet smaller than what they had been living in and approximately $800 more per month. I know this because Camille told me, not as gossip, but because she was genuinely worried about them and wanted me to know they were managing. They were managing. Renata went back to working full-time. She had been working part-time for the previous 2 years, which I had not known and which, I realized when I learned it, explained a significant portion of their financial calculus. Daniel called me 3 weeks after they moved out, not to argue but to ask if Priya could come stay for a weekend. I said yes. He said thank you. We didn't discuss the house. Lydia reviewed the home equity inquiry with a real estate attorney colleague to confirm that no fraudulent application had been submitted under my name. Nothing had been filed. Nothing had reached any institution. The inquiry had been exploratory and informal and had gone no further, which was, I want to be precise about this, the specific reason I did not pursue criminal charges. The changed locks were a civil matter, handled through civil proceedings. There was no felony to charge because the fraud had not been executed. Had it been executed, we would have been in a courtroom, not in my living room on a Friday evening. I want to be clear about that distinction because it matters. Howard Bay, my financial advisor, called me in September to review my portfolio, which had continued to perform in the consistent, unglamorous way that long horizon planning tends to produce when you leave it alone. He noted that the retirement account had grown to a number that made me sit quietly for a moment. Priya's college fund had grown to $81,000. Howard suggested we discuss whether to adjust the investment allocation. I told him to leave it alone. The mortgage paid off the following spring, 18 months as projected. I made the final payment on a Tuesday morning from my hospital office between a 9 o'clock consultation and a 10:30 telehealth block. I got an email confirmation. I forwarded it to Lydia with no message. She wrote back 2 words, "Well done." I still live on Meridian Crest Drive. I still go to work at Emory. I see Priya on alternating weekends, an arrangement that Daniel and I worked out without lawyers, which was probably the right way to do that particular thing. She is 4 years old and she calls me Nana, and last month she told me with complete confidence that my house smelled like cookies, even though I had not made cookies in approximately 3 weeks. I did not correct her. Camille came over for dinner in October, and we sat on the back porch until the temperature dropped too much to stay out there, and she told me that she had known something was wrong for a long time and had not known what to do about it. I told her that she had done the right things when it mattered. She nodded and looked at her hands. We stayed on the porch a little longer anyway. I don't spend much time thinking about what Daniel believed the ending would look like. I have some idea. I think he imagined a version of events where I eventually moved somewhere smaller, where the house became his by a kind of quiet accumulation of presence and time, where I looked back on it later and understood that it had made sense. I think he told himself that story genuinely, which is not the same as the story being true. The house is mine. It has always been mine. The paperwork agreed. So, did I handle this exactly right, or should I have seen it coming sooner and moved faster? Tell me in the comments.